It landed like a sudden weight in your chest, the kind of moment that makes a room feel smaller, even though the cameras are wide open. Trump was planted dead center in CBS Studio 57 at 8:00 p.m. Eastern, with that familiar posture that says he thinks the whole building belongs to him. They'd squeezed roughly 400 people into a space that probably wanted 300, and you could feel the heat of it. Half the crowd in MAGA hats, the other half in AOC merch, everyone wound tight and waiting for impact. Margaret Brennan sat between them with the calm face of someone trying to convince America she was driving a car that already lost its brakes. 10 million viewers at home, maybe more with streams, and the air had that live broadcast electricity where one wrong sentence turns into a week of clips. Trump leaned forward with that Queens by way of Gold Towers energy, blunt and performative, but also weirdly precise when he wants to be. He started by framing it like a working-class morality play, the way he always does when he senses blood in the water. He eyed AOC's outfit like it was evidence on a courtroom table and basically said, "Look at the cost, look at the contrast, look at the lecture you're about to give me." AOC shifted, still composed, wearing that expression that reads like, "I've survived worse than you," even if her hands were starting to tense on the chair. Margaret tried to interrupt, the classic moderator move, but Trump lifted one hand, flat palm, like he was pressing pause on a human being. He looked straight into the camera and spoke like he was talking to the nation over dinner, which is one of his odd talents. He promised 5 rounds, 5 examples, 5 little "see what I mean" moments, and the crowd leaned in because Americans love a numbered takedown. He teased the dress, the famous dress, the $35,000 dress, and you could hear the audience reacting like they already knew where he was going. The way he said it wasn't a legal claim, not exactly. It was more like a prosecutor's tone without the paperwork, heavy on insinuation and rhythm. And then he grinned, that grin that always reads like he's about to make someone regret showing up. He didn't do a slow build. He came out swinging with imagery. He painted the Met Gala as a temple of rich people, celebrating being rich, which is not entirely unfair as a description, even if it's also a little cartoonish. He repeated the ticket number, $35,000, like it was a bell he wanted to ring until the room started humming with it. Then he brought up the "Tax the Rich" dress, the slogan on the back, the irony sitting there like a neon sign. You could feel the audience tilt, because irony is one of the few bipartisan sports left in America. He landed a nickname, Socialist Socialite, and you could see it stick in real time, because nicknames are his native language. AOC's face tightened just a notch, not a meltdown, but enough for the cameras to catch that flash of irritation. He paced a little, building momentum the way he does when he's feeding off a crowd, and it stopped being a debate and started being a show. He framed it as, "While you were sipping champagne with celebrities, your people were watching," and that "your people" phrase did the work of 1,000 policy arguments. Was it fair? Was it complete? Was it the whole story? Those questions hovered. But the point wasn't fairness. The point was impact. Then he did the thing that changes a room. He pulled the audience into the story. "How many of you donated to her campaign?" he asked, and hands went up slowly, like people were suddenly unsure they wanted to be seen. He pointed at them one by one, turning private political support into public testimony. And that's a powerful, risky kind of theater. AOC stared down at her notes like they were a shield, and that avoidance alone became its own message to viewers. Trump's voice softened into a "let me tell you about one of them" cadence, and you knew he was setting up a human symbol. He introduced Maria, just Maria, elderly, Queens, a working life story that could belong to 100 families in any borough. He described her budget in specific numbers: Social Security, rent, what's left, and the room went still because numbers can be brutal when you slow down. He framed her $50 donation as groceries, medicine, a kid's birthday gift, and the audience absorbed it the way people absorb a sad news package. Now, is that exactly how campaign finance works in a neat line from donor to dress? Or is that a rhetorical shortcut designed for maximum sting? That question is part of the point, because live TV loves a clean arc, even when reality is messy. He put his hand on Maria's shoulder like he was blessing the story, and the cameras moved in because TV knows what a close-up does. He said Maria wanted to buy her granddaughter a $35 dolo, the kind of detail that's so ordinary it feels like truth, even if it's partly stagecraft. He claimed Maria sent the $50 instead, believing she was funding a fight for working people. And that belief became the real commodity in the room. Then he described Maria seeing the Met Gala footage later and having to explain why there was no present, and you could hear the crowd start to rumble. Anger traveled from the back rows forward like weather rolling in. People started yelling, "Give it back! Fraud!" the kind of shouted language that turns a studio into a town hall for one ugly minute. AOC lifted a hand to her throat, a protective gesture people don't plan, the kind your body does when it senses danger. Margaret tried to restore order with paper thumping and polite words, but polite words don't beat adrenaline. Trump waited for the sound to crest because he understands timing the way comedians and boxers understand timing. Then he returned to the numbers. $35,000 ticket, $35,000 at your address, and stacked them like bricks. He implied the $70,000 total was basically built from people like Maria, and you could feel the logic click in the audience even if analysts would later pick at it. AOC tried to respond, talking about statement and protest and opportunity, and Trump swatted it away by comparing fashion symbolism to empty cupboards. He leaned hard into the contrast. Maria wasn't invited. Maria was working. Maria was serving people who could afford the party. That contrast isn't a court filing, but it is a moral accusation, and those are often more damaging than legal ones. Maria stood up, trembling, and said 4 words. "I trusted you." And it hit the room like a dropped glass. You could almost hear the broadcast feeding that moment into a million living rooms, because disappointment sells better than rage. Trump pressed with yes or no questions about attendance and cost, and AOC answered in fragments, the way people answer when they're trying to thread a needle on live television. She said she didn't pay, or she tried to, and he translated that into, "You still benefited," because that's the narrative he wanted. Was the Met Gala the central moral test of a legislator's integrity, or was it a shiny proxy people could argue about forever? The show chose proxy because proxies are easier than policy. He called it Round 1 and promised worse to come, like he was selling a series instead of having a conversation. The crowd fed him applause, and that applause worked like fuel, changing his tone from sharp to gleeful. AOC's side of the room went quieter, not necessarily convinced, but aware that the room's temperature had shifted. Margaret attempted a break, and Trump brushed it off because control is his favorite currency. Then he moved to lifestyle, the broader theme. Do you live what you preach? He claimed she drove a Tesla and made it sound like a personal indictment, not an environmental choice or a logistical detail. He did the math aloud. $50,000 equals 2 years of salary for real people. And the crowd nodded, because those comparisons feel intuitive. He asked how many people drove a car worth more than $10,000, and only a few hands went up, which gave him a statistic he could point at. AOC tried to explain reliable transportation, And Trump treated the explanation like an admission that she's allowed comfort while others aren't. It's a familiar move. Turn a normal human need into a symbol of hypocrisy and let the audience do the rest. He added apartment rent, $2,600 for a two-bedroom in a nice neighborhood, then contrasted it with Queens families paying that for less. He threw in Whole Foods and Instagram, a little sprinkle of cultural shorthand meant to signal elitism without saying the word. He talked about designer clothes and clearance racks, and you could hear the audience recalibrating her image in their heads. Now, is it fair to measure a public official's authenticity by grocery store branding and rent estimates? Or is that just the modern version of judging someone by their shoes? The room didn't care about fairness because the room was watching a story, not reading a budget report. Trump leaned into the persona shift, from bartender hero to comfortable celebrity, and he made it sound like a betrayal of the origin story. AOC tried to interrupt with something about fighting for cleaners and service workers, and Trump snapped the focus back to the material. What you own, what you drive, what you pay. He said she wanted socialism for everyone else and capitalism for herself, which is a line that plays because it's simple. It's also a line that ignores the difference between policy preference and personal consumption. But simplicity is the whole point. By then, the crowd's noise wasn't just partisan. It was the kind of general roar you get when people smell a contradiction. He framed that as round two, and he made sure the audience understood he was keeping score. He pointed at the cameras again, telling viewers at home that they were watching the real version of her, which is always a red flag phrase in politics. Because the real usually means the version that helps my argument, and people forget that in the moment. AOC looked smaller in her chair, not physically, but in presence, like someone who realized the stage had tilted against them. Then Trump reached for the next folder, thicker papers, a prop designed to say, "I have receipts." He pivoted to Amazon, the Queen's HQ2 saga, and he delivered it like a murder mystery with one suspect. 25,000 jobs, he repeated, and he spoke the number the way he spoke $35,000. As a hammer, he wanted to keep swinging. He described real jobs, good jobs, and cast the opposition as a Twitter victory party against people who needed paychecks. AOC tried to argue about subsidies and fairness, and Trump countered with salary numbers, $85,000. Like that ended the debate. It didn't end the debate in policy terms, but it did end it in show terms. He claimed she denied her district a $55,000 raise, a clean line that makes economists cringe and audiences clap. Then he pulled the crowd in again. "How many of you applied?" And hands went up, a lot of them, which made the room feel like a grievance hearing. People stood and told stories, moving their family, better schools, a path out of survival mode, and the show turned into a chorus of could have been. Now, those stories may reflect real pain, and they may also be amplified for effect, because live TV loves personal testimony. Either way, the stories landed because the underlying fear is real. Missed opportunity doesn't care about ideology. Trump stood among them, letting the anger take shape, then translated it into a moral claim. You chose applause over livelihoods. AOC tried to say, "We can't let corporations," and Trump reframed it as, "You decided," making it personal, not systemic. He implied she never consulted the very people she claimed to protect, and that's a serious charge even when framed as a question. The crowd began chanting, "Where are the jobs?" and AOC covered her ears, an image that would live forever as a meme, whether it was fair or not. Trump waited again, because he understands that silence after noise is where the camera finds meaning. He said there weren't other opportunities, turning a complicated economic development timeline into a clean moral verdict. He looked into the camera, and framed it as working people paying the price while she enjoyed comfort, repeating the core theme. AOC's mouth moved, but the moment wasn't built for nuance, and her words got swallowed by the rhythm of the show. Trump claimed he was speaking for those left behind, which is always a powerful claim when you have a live crowd backing it. Then he opened the next folder and said the next topic crosses a line, because every story needs a darker turn. He brought up her grandmother in Puerto Rico and the viral house photo, a storyline that already lives in the public imagination. He compared two images, one she posted, one journalists took, and used the contrast to suggest exaggeration without saying the word lie as a formal allegation. He raised the question of money raised, over $100,000, and asked where it went, and the room went uncomfortably quiet. AOC tried to answer with vague causes, and Trump demanded specificity, using receipts, language people understand from the internet. Now, is that a fair demand? And would any politician have perfect accounting ready in a live debate format? Or is that the trap? It felt like a trap, and traps are effective on television because the audience assumes the trapped person must be guilty of something. He framed it as using family for fundraising, which is morally sticky, even if the administrative reality is more complicated. He invited Puerto Rican audience members to raise hands, and some did, and then he asked if any received help, and they shook their heads. That kind of moment doesn't prove anything in a legal sense, but it creates an emotional verdict in real time. AOC put her face in her hands and cried, and the cameras did what cameras do, closing in like the story needed a human crack. Trump described it as fraud in the language of ordinary outrage, then backed away into the safer zone of insinuation by talking about the real world. He suggested consequences that would happen to business people, which is a common populist move. Tell the audience there are two justice systems. AOC's defense came out fragmented, and fragmentation reads like guilt, even when it's just stress. The crowd's anger shifted from partisan to personal, because tragedy and money is a toxic mix for any politician. Then Trump announced Round 4, because the scoreboard itself had become part of the spectacle. By then, AOC looked exhausted, like she was wearing the entire internet on her shoulders. Trump didn't soften. He escalated into the Green New Deal, calling it a fantasy number, $93 trillion, and stretching the word trillion like it was a joke. He mocked the timeline and the idea of retrofitting every building, and the crowd laughed because infrastructure is one of those places where even idealists know reality bites. He mentioned cows and methane, leaning into the most meme-friendly version of the policy debate. Margaret tried not to smile, which told you even the people tasked with neutrality can get pulled by the current. He asked business owners in the crowd to raise hands, and many did, because every crowd has people who run something, even something small. He framed the policy as making their equipment illegal overnight, a dramatic way to describe regulation that might take years in practice. A man stood and said his family HVAC business would die, that he'd need money he didn't have, and the room listened because family business stories are American scripture. Others stood, a cascade of "we'd close," "we'd beat," "we'd lay off," "we'd here," "we'd be done," and the show turned into a parade of threatened livelihoods. Now, does that represent the actual policy pathway, or is it a dramatized projection of worst-case fears? It's probably some of both, and politics lives in that gray space where fears become facts in the mind. Trump pulled out an FAQ document and quoted lines about uncertainty, and he used those lines like a confession, even if they were part of an evolving proposal. He emphasized, "We aren't sure how to pay for it," and audiences heard, "They don't know what they're doing," which is the oldest critique in American politics. He accused her of posting and deleting, implying she knew it was indefensible, and the crowd reacted like they were watching a magician get caught. AOC didn't respond with policy detail, maybe because the format didn't allow it, maybe because she was overwhelmed, maybe because she knew the room wouldn't accept it anyway. Trump then made the central accusation of motive. You never planned to pass it. You planned to get applause. That's a hard thing to prove, so he framed it as a suspicion, a pattern, a question you're supposed to answer in your own head. He pointed to people who don't understand math, and the crowd cheered because nobody likes being told they're the sucker. By the time he said, "That's all five," the audience treated it like a verdict, not an argument. And AOC sat there, head down, not moving, like the show had rolled over her and kept going. Trump turned to the camera and summarized his thesis. One person, two lifestyles, and the gap between them. He described the Met Gala moment as a symbol of elites preaching sacrifice, and he repeated "working people" until it felt like a drumbeat. He described the car, the apartment, the shopping, the branding, and made it sound like evidence of betrayal rather than normal modern life. He looped back to Amazon as jobs taken away, and to Puerto Rico as money raised without clarity, and to the Green New Deal as fantasy as policy. In this format, once the pattern is established, every detail becomes proof, whether it deserves to or not. Margaret tried to wrap up, because that's what moderators do when the show begins to drift into riot energy. But the crowd noise swallowed her, and Trump basked in it, because basking is part of his political oxygen. AOC's supporters stayed seated, some angry, some stunned, some quietly wondering if defending her would just drag them into the wave. The room felt split between people who came to watch her win and people who came to watch her burn. And neither side got what they expected in a clean way. The ending wasn't closure so much as a cliffhanger. The cameras cut away. But the story had already escaped the studio. Within minutes, the clips were everywhere, chopped into bite-sized moral judgments and refed into the culture machine. People argued about whether the questions were fair, whether the numbers were accurate, whether the staging was manipulative, and that argument became the secondary spectacle. In the first hour, the view counts were the kind that make political operatives salivate, and the phrase "socialist socialite" started spreading like a cheap slogan on a t-shirt. Commentators on the right called it a masterclass, while commentators on the left argued it was a setup built to humiliate, and both sides sounded certain. The truth, as usual, sat somewhere in the middle. A performance designed to hit emotions, and it did. Some outlets focused on Trump's tone, because tone is safer than facts when you don't want to litigate details. Others focused on AOC's answers, because answers are easier to scrutinize than motives. And a third group focused on the crowd itself, because nothing tells you about national mood like a room of people yelling on cue. AOC's office lines were said to be overwhelmed, and even if the numbers were exaggerated, the sense of pressure felt real. Public figures don't collapse because of one segment alone. They collapse when one segment becomes a symbol of everything people already suspect. Then came the political aftershocks, the whispers of primary challenge, the predictable opportunism that follows any wobble. A challenger's story emerged in the chatter, someone framed as a real worker, an electrician, a union guy, a person with hands that look like work. The contrast ads wrote themselves: ordinary car versus electric car, normal apartment versus nicer apartment, work uniform versus red carpet photographs. Was it fair, or was it a simplistic morality play built to sell an identity, not a policy platform? That question didn't stop anyone from sharing it, because politics is a business, and narratives are the product. The Maria figure became a symbol in the retellings, whether she was a spontaneous audience member or a carefully chosen participant. People raised money for her online in a wave of generosity that can be real even when it's politically charged. Some said she bought a small house, others said the story was embellished, and the argument about the details became part of the larger argument about truth. Because in this era, truth often means the story that fits what I already believe. And that's the scariest part of all. AOC's supporters called it exploitation of an elderly woman. Trump's supporters called it accountability. And both sides claimed morality. In Queens, the local talk turned sharper, because local politics always has a more personal edge than national shouting. Small business owners talked about regulations, workers talked about wages, and activists talked about corporate power. And everyone claimed they were the real voice of the district. The Amazon episode resurfaced with fresh heat, as if time didn't pass and circumstances didn't change, because grief doesn't check calendars. People who wanted those jobs remembered the disappointment. People who feared displacement remembered their fears, and politicians tried to frame the memory in their favor. That's how these stories work. They become mirrors people use to see their own anxieties. Puerto Rican community leaders weighed in publicly in the retellings, some demanding clarity, some demanding respect, some demanding a stop to being turned into props. The grandmother photo episode, already controversial years ago, got recast as either compassion or opportunism, depending on which clip you saw. And once you're in that spin cycle, even ordinary acts, posting, fundraising, attending events, get interpreted as proof of something darker. AOC in the story as it spread became silent, then cautious, then allegedly isolated, a familiar arc for anyone caught in a viral storm. It's not that silence proves guilt. It's that silence in politics is treated like confession because the audience hates uncertainty. Inside her orbit, the gossip machine described staff turnover, advisors disappearing, people updating resumes, and those details were shared like they were confirmed facts. Some of it might have been true. Some of it might have been opportunistic storytelling, and the internet doesn't care which is which as long as it's dramatic. Opponents floated committee consequences and party leaders distancing because elites always distance when a brand threatens the larger brand. The phrase, "she speaks for herself," became a cold political sentence in the retellings, the kind that says, "you're on your own." And if you've ever watched politics up close, you know the most savage attacks aren't always loud. Sometimes they're quiet and bureaucratic. Meanwhile, Trump, in the viral version of events, rode the wave like he built the ocean. He framed it as reality versus fantasy, a theme he loves because it makes him the guy holding the calculator even when he's improvising. He hinted at bigger ambitions, bigger tours, bigger confrontations, because momentum is addictive and he knows how to monetize it. He repeated the lesson, don't preach one thing and live another. And the crowd at home ate it up because hypocrisy is the one sin Americans agree on. But here's the thing nobody says out loud. Everyone in politics sells an identity, and the real question is, how much identity is performance? AOC's supporters responded with their own narrative, that this was a staged ambush designed to weaponize class resentment against a progressive woman. They argued that attending a gala doesn't erase policy work, that driving a safe car doesn't invalidate a platform, that being visible doesn't make you corrupt. They pointed out how easily working class gets used as a prop by people who have never spent a day living with its insecurity. They asked why the loudest voices on hypocrisy rarely apply the same microscope to their own side's donors, lobbyists, and luxury. And those are fair questions, even if they don't change how the clip felt in the moment. Because the moment The real product of the night was emotional certainty. It wasn't a spreadsheet audit of campaign spending. It was a story about a $50 donor and a $35,000 party. And stories beat spreadsheets. It wasn't a nuanced debate about economic development trade-offs. It was 25,000 jobs said like a moral verdict, and slogans beat nuance. It wasn't an investigative accounting of disaster relief fundraising. It was where did the money go asked on live TV, and questions beat context. And it wasn't a policy seminar on climate transitions. It was $93 trillion, said like a punchline, and punchlines beat policy. So by morning, the narrative hardened the way narratives always harden online. Poll numbers floated through the conversation like they were fact. Approval ratings collapsed in the retelling because collapse is a satisfying word. A challenger surged because surge is what people want after they've decided the old thing is broken. The district turned into a battleground in the story, not because districts don't have real disagreements, but because stories love a clean revolt arc. And whether AOC actually faced that precise sequence of consequences is almost beside the point, because what mattered was the new label glued to her image. Socialist socialite became shorthand for a broader suspicion Americans already carry, that the people who talk like tribunes often end up living like insiders. It's the suspicion that someone can use working-class language as a ladder, then kick the ladder away once they climb. It's also the suspicion that wealthy and powerful people can cosplay as outsiders whenever it benefits them, and audiences will still buy the costume. Those suspicions aren't unique to one politician. They're baked into the modern political economy where fame and fundraising are intertwined. But it's easier and more entertaining to attach that suspicion to one face and call it truth. That's why the Maria figure mattered so much in the story. She made the abstract personal. When you say small donors, it sounds like a category. When you say grandma couldn't buy a doll, it sounds like a wound. Even if the detail is partly dramatized, it triggers the same emotion because everyone recognizes the feeling of being used. And once people feel used, they don't care about footnotes. They care about punishment, even when nobody says that word out loud. They want the world to make sense again. And a villain helps the world make sense. In the retelling, AOC searched for an exit strategy. Books, speaking gigs, platforms, and doors closed because stories love the image of banishment. Media projects were described as cancelled because cancellation is the modern symbol of status loss. Former allies stayed quiet because politics is full of friends until it isn't, and silence becomes its own loud statement. A brand that once felt unstoppable began to feel fragile, and fragility is contagious in public life. That's the real danger of moments like this. They don't just critique a person, they teach audiences to treat politics like a humiliation sport. And humiliation sports don't require truth. They require momentum. They require the crowd to feel they're watching a reckoning, even if the reckoning is built from selective facts and amplified emotion. They require the target to appear defensive or overwhelmed because composure is half the battle and panic is its own evidence. They require the attacker to look confident because confidence reads as competence even when the argument is stitched together. And they require the viewer to leave with a simple story they can repeat in one breath. That's why the night, as framed, ended with a moral. You can't preach one life and live another. It's a moral that sells because it sounds like common sense, like your grandfather saying, "Practice what you preach" at the dinner table. But it's also a moral that can become a weapon, because once people decide your life contradicts your message, nothing you say will be heard. Every purchase becomes proof, every photo becomes evidence, every absence becomes confession. Every explanation becomes an excuse. That's not justice. That's spectacle. And spectacle doesn't care who it burns as long as the fire looks bright. Still, the questions that story raised aren't fake just because the show was theatrical. Should politicians who brand themselves as anti-elite be held to a higher standard of personal consistency, or is that just another trap to keep outsiders from ever looking comfortable? Is it hypocritical to move in elite spaces to push a message, or is it naive to think you can change power without touching power? How much transparency do voters deserve when money is raised in the name of a cause? And how much complexity can a voter realistically process before they tune out? And why do we demand perfection from some while excusing indulgence from others who don't even pretend to be virtuous? If you're honest, you can hear the double standards humming underneath the story. Trump himself has lived in luxury for decades, and his brand is literally luxury. So his outrage about luxury always carries a comedic edge, whether he intends it or not. Yet he can still weaponize luxury as hypocrisy when the target's brand is virtue, because hypocrisy is comparative, not absolute. That's the game. You don't have to be pure, you just have to make the other person look impure relative to their own claims. And once that perception locks in, the rest is just replay. So the studio moment became a template in the retellings, a warning political operatives whispered about in both parties. Keep your receipts. Keep your story straight. Don't hand your opponent an easy symbol. Don't let your image drift too far from your message. Because in this era, the facts people remember are often the images, a slogan dress, shaking hands, a hand over the ears, a face in the palms. And those images can outlive any policy, any vote, any committee hearing, because images don't require context to feel true. That's how reputations die now. Not in courtrooms, not in long reports, but in moments compressed into 30 seconds. And that, more than any single accusation, is what makes the whole spectacle unsettling. It's not just that a politician might have contradictions, because everyone does. It's that contradictions are now treated like final proof of moral worth. It's not just that a crowd can be manipulated, because crowds always can. It's that the manipulation is now a product people share with glee. It's not just that truth gets bent. It's that bent truth can still teach a lesson people want to learn, so they accept the bend. And once the audience learns that lesson, politics as takedown, it's hard to teach them anything else.